To God be the glory.
Hello, welcome back to the study of Ruth. We'll be reading and considering the lessons to be learned in chapter 2 in this session. When we read the first 5 or 6 verses of the book of Ruth, we might have thought that this story is going to be about Elimelech and his family. But no, it's not. In chapter 2, we begin to see what the real story is. The focus changes from Naomi to Ruth. Things change for Naomi, and they change because of Ruth, because of Ruth's faith. Where do you think this faith came from? If you want to have faith in God, you need to read His Word. What stories about God do you think Naomi, Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion told to Ruth and Orpah? Remember the time frame. Ruth and Naomi lived in the time of the judges, so they didn't tell the story of David and Goliath. The story of Ruth takes place before David was born. Perhaps they told the stories of Noah and the great flood, the story of Abraham being called by God to go to Canaan, about Abram being told to sacrifice his son, Isaac, about God saving His people through Joseph, about Moses leading God's people out of slavery in Egypt, about God providing for His people on their way to the Promised Land. You know, the parting of the Red Sea, the water from the rock, the provision of manna and quail, and the story of Jericho's walls falling down. These are incredible stories. To Ruth, though, these stories were more than stories of a culture. They were messages about a powerful God. And like Rahab in Joshua chapter 2, Ruth believed them, and these stories built faith. We're about to see how Ruth's faith works a change for both Ruth and Naomi. Chapter 2 introduces a new beginning for Ruth and Naomi. And isn't that what life is? One beginning after another, because nothing stays the same. No matter how things are in your life right now, maybe things are going well. Maybe they're not going well at all. No matter, this too shall pass. And it might pass today or tomorrow or next week will be the new beginning. Are you trusting God with your new beginning? Let's see if Ruth and Naomi are trusting God with theirs. Naomi left Bethlehem with possessions. She said she went away full, and she returned to Bethlehem with what she could carry. She and Ruth didn't know what the next day would bring. At the beginning of this chapter, things look pretty bleak, but Ruth trusted. Let's read chapter 2, verses 1 through 16. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, Go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, The Lord be with you. And they answered, The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, Whose young woman is this? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, She's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Then Boaz said to Ruth, Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." And at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread, and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." Verse 1 of chapter 2 introduces us to Boaz, and verse 2, Ruth the Gentile says to Naomi the Israelite, "Let me go to the field of someone who will allow me to glean among the ears of grain." Ruth is claiming her privilege as a poor stranger or foreigner to glean. Look at Leviticus 19:9 to read about this right that she has. This to me is another indication that she's been taught God's laws. She volunteered to go find a field where she could gather grain so they could eat. I don't know why Naomi didn't offer to go and glean too. I don't know how old Naomi is. Perhaps the infirmities of old age wouldn't allow her to do that kind of work. And I don't know about her health. I don't know if crossing mountains and walking 50 miles just used up all her strength, or if her bitterness used up all her strength. I do know that bitterness will sap you of your strength. Bitterness makes you believe nothing good can happen. Bitterness closes you off to seeing the good in life. Whatever the reason, Naomi does not offer to help with the gleaning. And you know what the wise man who wrote Ecclesiastes says about two working together, don't you? Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through 12. "Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who's alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken." Naomi is disconnected from God. One thing she could do to restore that relationship with God is to serve others. If she was able, it would have done her a world of good to have replied to Ruth, "Yes, let's both go glean in the fields. We'll bring home more grain that way." Instead, Naomi said, "Yes, you go." Ruth didn't know where or who or how she would be received. She just trusted. Faith motivates us to do. And in verse 3, we see that she just happened to come to the field belonging to Boaz. He's a relative, but Ruth doesn't know that. His name means mighty man, and in one translation, he's called worthy man, and in another, he's called a devout man. So let's see from what is written in this chapter what kind of man Boaz is. Usually, heroes are easier to admire than they are to define, But as you follow along in your Bible with me, we'll be able to see a hero in Boaz. On this particular day, he came out from Bethlehem. Perhaps he had business in town and was returning to his property. Perhaps he had a home in town. He's a man of standing. He owns fields and he hires workers. He has wealth. Isn't it interesting that Boaz managed to stay in Bethlehem during the famine and thrive? That makes me wonder if Elimelech could have done the same. In a later chapter, we see that Boaz knew the law of God and was a devout follower. In verse 4 of chapter 2, we see that he greets his workers with a prayer, and they call back to him with a blessing. I sense that his workers like and respect him. I see that they recognize in each other a love and respect for God. There's something about Ruth that catches his attention. Maybe she's beautiful. Maybe her dress is that of a foreigner. Or perhaps it's just that he recognizes that she's not one of his regular employees and has never gleaned in his field before. When he asks, whose young woman is this, what he really wants to know is she married? Who does she belong to? Does she have a male family member to protect her? Boaz sees Ruth for the first time, but we'll read in a minute that he's already heard about her. Verse 8, Boaz sees this stranger, and there's no, hey, you, what are you doing in my field? Instead, he calls her my daughter. He's treating her like family. He is respectful to this young foreign woman. This greeting also indicates that he's older than she. And as you scan down through this chapter, you can see that Boaz is a generous man. He tells Ruth, to glean with his servant girls. The law gave her the right to glean in the corners and along the edges. The corners were to be deliberately left for the alien and for the poor and for the widow. But the corners don't hold much grain. Boaz tells her to glean only in his field, and instead of along the edges, she's to glean through the whole field. We can also see, as we scan through here, that Boaz is protective toward women. Ruth is a foreigner. Often foreigners are mistreated in any culture, but a Moabitess in Bethlehem, for sure. Verse 8 says that Boaz told Ruth to stay close to his female workers. And furthermore, in verse 9, he told his male employees not to touch her. And in verse 15, he told his young male workers not to taunt her, not to insult her, but rather to treat her well. He gave Ruth the same considerations he gave his servants. He provided food, water, and rest. He treated all with respect and generosity. Boaz is thoughtful and kind. Verse 9 says, when you are thirsty, drink from the water my men have drawn. And in verse 14, he tells her to eat with the group. We also see in this chapter that he is a provider. He served her in verse 14. Eating with the owner would elevate her standing. Can't you just imagine the looks being exchanged by the other field hands? You know, like, what's up with this? What's the boss doing? She ate until she was satisfied, and she took leftovers home to Naomi. He told his men to pull some of the grain out of the bundles and to leave it for her to gather up and take home. And Ruth wants to know why he's helping her, a foreigner. That's verse 10. Does he reply, well, you're just so pretty? No, this is not a man who sees people as objects. His reply clearly informs us that he sees her character. She may have been beautiful, but the reason he gives her for being kind to her are about her character. Look at verse 11. But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. He recognizes her courage, her loyalty, her selflessness. Boaz is a hero. But now let's look at those same verses and see what kind of woman Ruth is. Start again at the beginning of the chapter, and then scan down through the verses as I point out some things. First of all, she's a woman who knows what she can do, and she sets out to do it. She takes the initiative, but she's respectful of her mother-in-law. She says, "Let me go to the field and glean." She defers to the older woman. She knows what needs to be done, but she asks permission. She's trusting God to provide. She doesn't know who it will be, but she trusts that someone will comply with Leviticus 19, verses 9 and 10, which reads, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God." Ruth knew her rights, but still she asked the foreman for permission to glean in the field. She had the law of God to back her up, but still she humbly asked. She gave the man in charge an opportunity to give. What courage, what humility, don't you agree? How difficult do you find it to ask someone to give you something, and especially something you have a right to? In verse 7, we see that Ruth is hardworking, she's steadfast. The foreman told Boaz that Ruth had been working since early morning, stopping only for a short rest. We see her being respectful and grateful in verse 10. And we're going to see in a minute that gratitude changes things for Ruth and Naomi. Verse 11, we see that Ruth is brave, loyal, and selfless. It takes courage to leave all you know and are familiar with and start anew among people who do things a lot differently than you. This Ruth did in order to take care of her mother-in-law. In verse 12, the words "takes refuge under God's wings" indicate that others can see that Ruth trusts God. Do these words remind you of something Jesus said in Matthew 23:37? With tears, Jesus says he longs to gather Jerusalem to him as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. Baby chicks are protected from predators like hawks under the mother hen's wings. Boaz and the townspeople recognize that Ruth trusts God to put his wings over her and protect her and provide for her. Verse 13. Ruth is a woman of discernment. She recognizes Boaz's kindness, and she expresses her appreciation to him. "You have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant." You have comforted me literally means you have spoken to my heart. That's beautiful. When someone speaks to our hearts, it comforts us. I hope you've experienced that comfort in your lifetime. Ruth is discreet, modest, not forward or presumptuous. Verse 14, Boaz invites her to join the group. She doesn't take the top seat. She sits with the workers. Boaz and Ruth, they belong together, don't they? Are you looking for your Boaz? May I suggest you keep a mental picture of this Boaz? Keep your eyes open for a devout child of God, respectful of others, generous, protective of women, thoughtful of others, a man who will recognize all the good that's in you and be an encouragement to you, a man who gives all glory to God. You might also want to think about Ruth's character traits that Boaz found attractive. Be like Ruth. Be respectful of others. Be a hard and steadfast worker. Show gratitude. Be brave, loyal, and selfless. Recognize the kindnesses in others and express appreciation for their kindness. Be discreet and modest, not forward or presumptuous. In Ruth chapter 2, Ruth receives from the field of Boaz. In chapter 3, she seeks a relationship with him. Don't get stuck in your own chapter 2, where you are receiving God's blessings, but you're not making a commitment to Him. In a previous video, we considered what could happen in 10 years. For Naomi, the 10 years in Moab brought tremendous loss and the marvelous gain of a daughter-in-law who is better than 7 sons, according to the women of Bethlehem in chapter 4. In these last verses of chapter 2, we see what a difference one day can make. Ruth trusted Jehovah, and that's what made the difference in her life and in the lives of those she loved. Sometimes we have to just trust God in spite of the bad things that happen in our lives, in spite of the bad things that happen to us. Let's read verses 17 through 22. So she gleaned, that is, Ruth gleaned, until the evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. In verse 17, we read that Ruth gleaned until evening. She stayed the course. She completed the task. You know, just because the boss singles you out for special attention doesn't mean you can cut out early. Working a full day or leaving early is about who you are. Working until the end of the day shows steadfastness. Ruth's steadfastness and Boaz's generosity netted her 3/5 of a bushel of barley. This would be enough to feed the 2 women for a week. Can you imagine how surprised Naomi was when Ruth brought home such a load of grain? Imagine her further surprise when Ruth handed her the remainder of her lunch. And this was not leftovers from a lunch she took to work, but leftovers from the lunch provided by the owner of the field. Can you hear Naomi's voice? I think hope is kindled. Naomi asks in verse 19, she's looking at all that Ruth had brought home, remember. "Where did you glean today?" And before she even knows the answer, she calls down a blessing on the field owner. "Blessed be the man who took notice of you." I was told that literally in the Hebrew, she said, "Blessed be the man who has not left off his hesed." H-E-S-E-D, hesed. That's a Hebrew word that cannot be translated into one English word. It's too complex. It's used in Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and the first part of 7. In that passage, God is describing himself. Moses had asked to see God's glory, and God's response was not to show his power and majesty, but to describe his love, his hesed. God's glory is seen in the way he loves. I learned about this word hesed when I was researching my lesson on the covenant. What the Bible Says About Covenant by Mont W. Smith has a lot to say about hesed. And on page 25 of the book, Mr. Smith says that the root idea of the word is to follow through on obligation. Hesed is covenant keeping, and it's always in the best interest of the other person. Hesed is a behavior, not an emotion. God's love, his hesed, is how he behaves. God is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in faithfulness, maintaining and forgiving. I think Naomi's use of the word hesed when she spoke to Ruth in verse 17 regarding the man who provided such bounty might have caused her to remember the hesed of her God, the steadfast love of God. When we know God, but we forget him for a season, seeing his character in someone else will remind us of him. When you, ladies, when you are behaving like God, you may be the very one to remind someone of God, to point them toward God. Boaz didn't know the effect of his hesed, his behavior. He didn't know the effect that would have on these two widows. He was simply being a devout child of God. You don't know what effect your behavior will have on others. You may never know. Be like God anyway in your steadfast love toward others. We now see a change in Naomi. Her bitterness gave her a feeling of emptiness. Think about it. If you're feeling bitter, you might be the problem, just as was the case for Naomi. A change from bitter to pleasant for Naomi begins with gratitude. That's true for us as well. Paul tells us in 1 Thessalonians 5:18, "In everything give thanks." That means in the bad times as well as the good times. Gratitude is not easy sometimes, but it is the antidote for bitterness. Think about it. 3/5 of a bushel of grain, and the hesed of a landowner declares to Naomi immediately that they don't have to worry about tomorrow. It also means Ruth has been accepted. She will not be chased away. And now Ruth and Naomi have much for which to be grateful. All this causes Naomi's gratitude to pour out in a blessing on the field owner who had been generous to Ruth. Look at verse 20. "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Do you hear hope in this prayer? Boaz's behavior has reminded Naomi of God's character, his loving kindness. What she declares is that God is remembering the living, that's herself and Ruth, and the dead, that's Elimelech and their sons. Why does she say he's remembering these dead people? Because she immediately realizes there's hope for herself and for Ruth. She knows Boaz is a relative, and as a near relative, he has the power to redeem the property that belonged to Elimelech and more, which we'll talk about later. Remember our reading earlier from Deuteronomy 25? This part of God's law to the Israelites is called the Levirate, Levirate law, and provides a way to continue the family name and to keep property within the family. Naomi is beginning to see a way out of their poverty, and she's beginning to be reminded of God's providential care. Providential care. Providence is not miraculous. Providence is God using natural processes to work his will. When Israel drifted into idolatry, God would withdraw his blessings and enemies would attack and overrun the country. Famine would follow. Then the Israelites would repent of their idolatry and cry to God for help. These are all natural processes. In the story of Ruth, a family moved to Moab where there was food. The sons married. Sons and husband died. Mother-in-law heard things were better at home. Mother-in-law and daughter-in-law went to Bethlehem. Daughter-in-law volunteered to work and just happened to choose to work in a field owned by Boaz. Boaz just happens to show up on that very day during the time Ruth was there. All natural processes. Providence is a mystery. We can't really explain it, but it's something like this. Mark 16:20 says, "And they went out and preached everywhere while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by accompanying signs." Providence is something like God working with us. I don't know how. Philippians 2:13 says, "For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure." God works in us. I don't know how. And Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, to those who are called according to his purpose." God works for us. We can't explain providence, but we can trust it. Chapter 1 ended with Naomi and Ruth facing a challenging future. Chapter 2 ends with hope. Naomi recognizes that Ruth will be safe with the women working in Boaz's field and tells her to stay with them, which she does through the barley and wheat harvest. That's about 3 months. And the last sentence in this chapter says, "And she," that is Ruth, "lived with her mother-in-law." Girls, it can be done. A half a bushel of grain and Boaz's words to Ruth kindled hope. One person can change a situation, which can change another person's outlook. Be the change, ladies. We'll stop here for now. Please come back for our next session in which we complete our study of the book of Ruth.